Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have had to evacuate through Russia or were forcibly deported there. They have experienced terrible things like the filtration camps on the borders, separation from families, cruel interrogations by Russians, and being forced to live in another country, the enemy country, without money or documents in many cases. Left stranded and struggling to leave Russia by themselves. Some, like children, do not even have the option to try and return home or go to Europe. Ukraine has been able to find and return a few hundred children, but for victory to be achieved, they must locate and return many thousands of them. Even when the fighting ends, victory will not be achieved until all the children return home to Ukraine. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is now available on popular podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And if you enjoy the content, consider supporting us by becoming a patron. We'll be adding exclusive content there, such as chats and FAQs and extended conversations with our fantastic guests. Kateryna Pavlevych is a PR specialist by day and writer by night. She is a Ukrainian native that lives in New York. Kateryna's skills are independent PR, comms, and advocacy. She is a contributor to the PR Army of Ukraine, a volunteer at the RAZOM for Ukraine, and a strong speaker and advocate in the campaign Where Are Our People? And recently spoke at the UN in New York on this very issue. Kateryna, I'm delighted to have you on the channel.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to make it to your list of amazing speakers.
Well, let's jump in. This is actually an incredibly heavy topic, but I'd like first to put some context behind it. Let's break down what we're talking about here. We're talking about not evacuation, as many of the newspapers called it. We're talking here really about abduction, people being separated from their families, forcible deportation, filtration camps, and the most horrific aspect of this, of course, is the illegal adoption of children. So could you break down the kind of scale of the problem and when it began?
I think it's a really complicated problem, and it seems new to many people out of Ukraine, but it's all over the world. Deportation of like massive deportations like Russia is conducting right now is an old tool that imperialistic Russia and Soviets were applying to put down any anti-imperialistic movements, any rebellious movements, any nationalistic movements that were happening within the empire. Deportations, probably one of the most famous one in Ukrainian history, was applied against Crimean Tatars in 1944. But before that, any national majorities that were about to unite, like Greeks or Krimchaki or like Estonians, many people who have been deported throughout the history of imperialistic Russia and Soviet Union and now Ukraine. So when I hear that this is a new, unexpected policy of Russia, I just want to make clear that it's not new, it's old, they're really good in it, and it's been taking place in Ukraine, both in Soviet times, but also since the Russian invasion in 2014 in Donbass. Russia has been deporting people from any occupied areas it was getting since 2014. It became massive and more obvious probably since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. I believe the first media reports appeared in summer. We've been tracking this topic in the Ukrainian PR army since late spring, summer, but formed a separate direction of work dedicated to the topic of deportation in autumn. And that was our first question: what's the scale of this problem? How many people are actually deported? How many adults, and so on. And that's probably one of the most complicated topics, even though it should be the basics of the conversation. How many people? It is impossible to provide one exact number because the deportations are happening on all occupied and Russian-controlled territories. Crimea, Donbass, when as they were advancing into Kharkiv and Kherson, deportations took place there. We had no access, and we still have no access to places like Mariupol or Crimea to know for sure how many people are deported. But we, based on like estimates and the witnesses' testimonies Ukraine gets, we talk about over 2 million deported Ukrainians in general. That's the number Ukrainian Commission of Human Rights is quoting, 2.8 million. That includes children. It's hard to say, again, how many children have been deported. Ukraine has identified by name over 16,000 for now, but this number is growing as we get new information about missing children. However, the more correct estimates would be dozens of thousands of children. Some researchers quote the number 50,000, others 150,000 deported children. Based on Russian open resources, they claim they've deported over 700,000 children. There is no way to know the truth because Russia doesn't let any observers to the facilities where they keep the deported people, or doesn't provide any records of people they took out of occupied territories. So while it's a very good question, unfortunately, I don't have an exact answer. Experts don't, but we're talking about over 2 million of Ukrainians and dozens of thousands of Ukrainian children among them.
Now, Russia won't, of course, use the word deportation. They'll call it a rescue. They'll call it, looking after
evacuation.
Refugees. Yeah. But it's also, as well as not being able to put a figure on this, it's also impossible to know, how many people chose that direction, although it's not really much of a choice, is it? When you're faced with an active front line on one side and, Russia on the other, it's not really any kind of choice at all. And we don't know how much threat or coercion people were under. Do we know how many people have returned? Because some have been able to get out of Russia. And this obviously is far more difficult for children, especially if they're not with parents or carers. But some adults have been able to find their way back, not necessarily into Ukraine, but into Europe, haven't they?
Yes, it's true. We don't know how many people were returned. Many adults find the way to get out. They don't necessarily return to Ukraine. And once they get out, they usually don't report that I was in Russia and got back. So we do know that out of 16,000 identified children, just a little bit over 300 were returned, which seems like a very low number. But it's not because Ukrainian government volunteers to do anything. It's because the process of return of those children is extremely complicated, and that's why it should be prevented rather than solved some other time. So when we talk about this is evacuation, shockingly Russia calls it evacuation, we have to understand also the terminology. What is deportation? What is evacuation? What is forcible transfer? We in Where Are People deal with forcible removals of people. So, and by forcible, it's not always that people were physically taken and put on the bus and sent into a unknown direction. It's also where people were trying to get out of Mariupol to Ukraine, but they couldn't because there was no humanitarian corridor, or the humanitarian corridors were multiple times bombed and it was too unsafe to get out to Ukraine. So they were forced by circumstances to go to Russia. And there, as you said correctly, there are multiple cases where people just trying to get out of the shelled cities went to Russia and then from Russia tried to go somewhere else, and often in neighboring countries. So this is one way of deportation, which is still forced, but really hard for people to understand because, you got on a bus, how could you be forced? Is it actually a choice when you have no choice? There's also many media, many experts use different terms for deportations, calling it removal, relocation of children, relocation of adults. This is not correct term. The only applicable and appropriate term for that is deportation if people are taken into another country, in this case Russia, or forcible transfer. It's when people from, say, Mariupol are sent to Donbas filtration camps. So they are within their country, but they are on occupied territories and they didn't choose to be there. Forcible transfers, when orphans from Kherson are sent to Crimea against their will, no other way to go. It's still Ukraine, but Ukraine can't go there and help them and provide them with the rights and any capabilities. They're there because Russia transferred them there.
And the authorities in Crimea and the Donbass have played a key role in this whole deportation process, haven't they?
Yes, absolutely. What we see is usually the usual scheme of deportation is taking people from newly occupied cities like Mariupol or Kherson or Izum, send them through filtration in so-called LNR or DNR, where they go through filtration camps. And after that, they distribute children to orphanages deeper in Russia, or they deport people deeper into Russia for controlled facilities. And then in Russia, they impose Russian citizenship on children and adults. They interrogate adults, they eradicate the children, submit children for adoption, and adults cooperate with the Russian government and witness against the Ukrainian government. And this is the stories I know because we work with witnesses who confirmed cases like that. So the authorities in like Crimea and like Donbas play a crucial role in deportations, being like a transfer hub in between newly occupied cities and Russia.
And that, in fact, that process you're describing there, I mean, that, to put a label on it, is essentially kidnap and blackmail, isn't it? Because if you hold the children, you then can control the adults, whether you want to then use them to support the war effort or whether you even want to mobilize them to fight their own people. Do you have sort of documented cases of what they are forcing the adults to do when they have the children hostage?
Absolutely. We work with witnesses, and many people ask, why would Russia do it? Why would Russia do it? There are many, many reasons why Russia deports Ukrainians. One of those reasons is that children are like a bait to lure adults into Russia. For example, there are cases when Russians were shelling Kharkiv region, and they were shelling people and say, well, do you want to send your kids somewhere safe while the war is going on? And some adults agree to do that. They send their kids away from the bombing into so-called kids or recreational camps. But then when the Ukrainian army liberated the areas, Russians would not return the children. They forced adults to come pick them up. And one of our witnesses, so she was a nurse in Izum, and her mother was killed by shelling, and her son has been brought to her as a patient, heavily wounded. She couldn't take care of him, so Russians took him into a Russian-controlled hospital and left no contact with her son. And she was looking for him for a couple months until someone told her that they saw her son in Moscow hospital. So she was forced to go there to take her son back. And while she was there, she was forced to take Russian citizenship. And of course, while you're in Russia, you're hostage of the regime there. It seems easy to get out, but it is not, especially considering that Russian patrol became harsher and harsher as they started losing war and more and more. So imposing Russian citizenship on children, on adults, creating all kind of obstacles for them to leave is one of the reasons to make people stay. And another reason of deportation is any Ukrainian in Russia is a hostage, is a leverage for Russia to negotiate, is a leverage for Russia to end war on its own terms, like a prisoner of war. You have your prisoners, you want to exchange those prisoners for something you want. any Ukrainian in Russia is a life leverage that Russia can apply whenever possible. There is no reason for Russians to just like take all the Ukrainians that are currently there, put them in one camp and say like, okay, we want these people back. Here's a list of our demands. Have to understand Russia is a terrorist state and a very successful terrorist state in that thing.
And historically, the process of deportation has also been used by Russia to destroy identities, to essentially ethnically cleanse, destroy identities, destroy people's willingness and ability to organize politically. We also know that this war against Ukraine, you can look at it from a big geopolitical point of view, but you can also look at it from a traditional Russian imperial lens, and that is to destroy any kind of resistance to Russification, to destroy any kind of political system that is not, under the control of Moscow. Is this aspect of the deportation, filtration and deportation also a part of this sort of genocidal assault on Ukrainian identity and nationhood?
Well, absolutely. As we saw multiple times, Russians are met with resistance on newly occupied areas, and they have to apply terror to beat that resistance, to scare people just enough to take over their territory. Massive murders, massive sexual assault, deportations, all that is part of the terror Russian armed forces apply once they come to a new territory. If you're busy looking for a child and you're more willing to cooperate with the local authorities so they help you return your child. So as I said, nothing new that happened before. And why don't we just take all the Ukrainians and integrate them into Russian society and bring the Russians into Ukraine to impose our values and Russian imperialist order in the newly occupied areas? It's as simple as that. Hasn't changed within 100 years. As I mentioned, Crimean Tatars were massively deported to like areas in Ural, and Russians were brought in Crimea to Russify it, so that 100, like not even 100, like 70, 80 years later, you could claim that Crimea has always been Russian. However, this is not true. We made it Russian.
And if we turn to the question of children, so you've already mentioned a couple of sources for the children. So this could be families within territories that were, under bombardment at the early stages of the war. Here we're talking about people who at that point may have had relatives who are alive. There may also be children whose relatives have died. But there are multiple categories, aren't there, or sources for children. Orphanages is another terrifying one. And could you list all the various sort of sources of children that Russia has used?
Yes, probably not all, just those that we know. The evacuation is orphans, deportation of orphans is easy. Nobody is looking for them. You can deport in simultaneously a lot of people. They're the most vulnerable. They're children. So why don't accelerate our efforts instead of going after every family? Just take those whose families aren't going to look for them. So orphanages in especially like Kherson region and Donbass, it's well-documented source of deportation of children. Also, another scheme is medical examination. There were reports, especially I think in Luhansk region, where like a lot of infrastructure, including hospitals, destroyed. So Russians would bring this medical like automobiles, mobile stations to examine children, and shockingly, then they find out that most of the children need further medical assistance, and since there is none in occupied areas because we destroyed it, let's take them all to Russia. And then under pretext of that medical treatment, they take kids to Russia, and in Russia, in order to receive that medical treatment for free, they give Russian citizenship to children, so that later, when you try to claim them back, it's much harder to work because they're already Russian citizenship, and you basically, then we can make, I guess, you're stealing Russians from Russia, even though they're Ukrainians from Ukraine. We know the cases when the child was sent on an evacuation bus to Ukraine, that humanitarian corridor, with his uncle, and the bus has been shut down. His uncle died, and the kid left with no care and was taken by Russian soldiers in orphanages to Russia. So that's like another source, when just like humanitarian corridors are shut down and they just take whoever survived and deport them. Yes, organizing, like terrorizing the cities and parents, and promises them that their child could be safe elsewhere, trying to manipulate on their fears, and also inability to refuse, because you're talking to a man with a gun, and taking children to so-called recreational camps and then never returning them and forcing, adults to come in is
Well,
another
that's
one.
one. Yeah, I was going to ask about that one because I wanted to dig a bit further into that one, especially because this is really horrific, and it shows, parents want to do the best for their children, and those perhaps in Kherson or even in other areas of Donbass were told that their children could go and have time away from the front line. They could go to children's camps where they'd be well treated, etc., etc. Now, we don't know whether they were treated well or not. We don't know if they had good food or not. We don't know. Well, we know they probably had training, militaristic training, etc. Indoctrination, we'll come to that one in a minute. But then when the parents were expecting these kids to return home, they just weren't. And all these barriers are put in place for them to get their kids. So could you explain a bit about that? Because that is horrific abuse of the trust of parents.
Yes. There's a lot of speculation on this particular case, because from the outside it seems like totally consensual. Parents agree to cooperate with the Russian forces, and they were asked to do that, not forced. So what's the problem? And it doesn't face a lot of understanding abroad and sometimes in Ukraine. People who haven't lived through occupation don't understand how you can give away your child to Russia. So these people face a lot of stigma. And sometimes, because it's really hard to understand the circumstances they were in, I was never under occupation. I don't know how it is to talk to a Russian soldier who's holding a gun while talking to me and inviting me to send my kid to a camp. I don't know how it feels living through bombing every day and fearing that your child may die every day. So I would not call that consensual when parents in despair send their children anywhere just away from war. But it does happen, and it is true that it's a betray of trust from people. But I mean, when did Russia care about it? Like, they always executed it in their own interest, and they always will. What we just have to understand is that the word voluntarily is very loose here, and from legal standpoint, there's nothing voluntary about it.
And let's then talk about what happens in these camps. I mean, we know some of the details, and again, it's not surprising because Russian children themselves are undergoing huge levels of indoctrination in schools, militaristic indoctrination, and that is bad enough. But here you have Ukrainian children being essentially Russified and going through the same or even more intense militaristic training. So what do we know about the format and subject and practice of these, let's say, sort of Russification regimes?
So, as you may know, as many people learned about this issue, was from the recent Yale report that identified 43, if I'm not mistaken, camps like this, or educational camps like this, and 2 of them at least were submitting children also for adoption. However, working in the topic of deportation long enough, we knew about this much sooner. That was obvious. Witnesses would talk about it pretty often. So this is very Russia's playing very long-term game here. If we remember the invasion in 2014 and Russia took over Donbass, there were kids there who were kids back then, but in 2022, they were already old enough to be drafted. And that kind of military upbringing basically raises future soldiers who will go and die in war that Russia initiated. So as in any totalitarianistic regime, this kind of training is integral part of like propaganda and making the resources, human resources for the future wars. And Russia isn't willing to send their own citizens to war. Whom it wants to send are ethnical minorities that are marginalized and not treated well in Russia, and Ukrainians who were re-educated enough to hate their own country because they were brainwashed in propaganda, and send them back and get them killed. Russia doesn't feel bad as for those children. Russia only feels bad about children for some politicians and elites. So this kind of military training has happened before, and it's not only military. The re-education takes steps on many levels. We work with witnesses who were forced to go to like Russian Orthodox Church, were made fun of for speaking Ukrainian. There are witnesses who say that they've been totally brainwashed and told that Ukraine is a bad country. They also tell that their parents gave them up. We work with one father who was separated from his children for over a month because he was in filtration camp. And all this time, his children were told that he gave up on them and joined the DNR army. Well, that was not true. So it's not only to like raise children, it's also to make them Russian and moreover anti-Ukrainian. It's a future tool of Russia in future wars to beat Ukraine. And that's what we have to understand. Russia plays long term. It's an empire. It doesn't think in a matter of years, but a matter of centuries. We can never be safe next to Russia, who plans on future wars of expansion, natural desire for an empire, until it's completely demilitarized.
That's it. So the denazification, demilitarization really needs to be applied to Russia. I don't think anyone has a complete solution for how that can actually happen at the moment. But the adoption, I think, is also one of the most horrific aspects of this. And some children may be orphaned, some children may have been orphaned by Russia, but some children may be forcibly pushed through an adoption process into new Russian families when their family members survive and have no knowledge of their whereabouts. I mean, what happens under those circumstances? Is it at the moment practically impossible to identify and relocate those children who've gone through that forcible adoption process?
So actually, the father I mentioned before, who was separated with his children, he was spent in infiltration camp for like 45 days. His children were sent first to orphanage in Donbass and then deeper into Russia. And once he got out of filtration camp, his older son called him and said, you have 5 days to come pick us up. Otherwise, we will be submitted for adoption. Some psychologist or I don't know, some doctor apparently evaluated that they need to be adopted. I don't know how it's possible, but everything is possible in Russia. So he literally had to make the trip, like just released from the filtration camp to Russia to regain his children back. Otherwise, they would be placed for adoption. He is the father of them. And we need to understand that Russia is doing like this adoption process. It sounds horrific to us, but they're actually not like concealing it or hiding. They're really put it out in public because it plays perfectly in the narrative of, first of all, Russians, and demonstrates that Russia is a rescuer. It came for Ukrainian orphans who were left by their government, by their families, and they rescued them, brought them into peaceful Russia, and forbidden them to those complete happy families. Somehow in Russian mindset and Ruski Mir they created, it's a perfect story of rescue. That's why families are willing to adopt Ukrainian children, because they feel like it's not just saving a child, it's saving a child from war and much, much worse future. So this was also an interesting story that many like Western journalists and maybe politicians bought, because obviously adoption of children whose parents were killed by Russia, adoption, relocation, deportation of those children, this is a war crime and part of genocide. But it's somehow executed well enough that some journalists are looking for excuses of it. And like the recent podcast on the Daily New York Times actually raised the question. I mean, yes, this is horrible, and those people are brainwashed, and those children are forcibly sent there. But considering they were taken from, occupied cities and from orphanages and put into families, aren't they better off? And this is hard to believe, but these conversations happens in intellectual circles, not only inside Russia that we know is like brainwashed and beyond rescue. This move worked well enough to persuade some of the, liberal democratic intellectuals that maybe it's better off. Maybe this act of genocide is better considering all the circumstances. What nobody mentions is that who caused that war in the first place? Why those children were not taken into Ukrainian families? Why didn't Russia come adopted all the Ukrainian orphans without invasion? Like, that somehow never makes it to the top of the questions.
And that is pure ignorance and lack of research on the part of the journalists or intellectuals who are discussing this, because let's be clear, everything we've described, whether those children are well looked after or not, whether they go through, brainwashing themselves and Russification or not, the very act of taking children to another territory without the explicit approval of the government and families, etc., that is classed as a war crime under the Geneva Convention. It doesn't matter what happens, good or bad, afterwards. The entire act is classed as a genocidal war crime. So there should be no question about, is it better or is it not? It is a crime, and those who are doing it should and hopefully will be prosecuted under the Geneva Conventions.
Yes, absolutely. And the irony is that most people agree it's not good, it's not legal. But then there is this human side that Russia is trying to play, because obviously legally it's wrong. Human side that, yes, it's illegal, but like if we take this particular child whom we interviewed and who shockingly feels happy in Russia because we interviewed her in Russia under supervision of her new foster family. I mean, isn't it better in this particular case for her, even though it's genocide, war crime against all the conventions and just like human rights violations? That's what Russia is playing. And even raising that question and playing so-called devil advocates and thinking, but maybe that seed of doubt is exactly what Russia is trying to do by these heartwarming stories of how an orphan who went through abandonment of parents, horrible times in orphanages, war, occupation, finally only in Russia found its family and love and understand it. With all the propaganda, brainwash, and the future in the Russian armed forces, but still good enough for now.
And this is we were talking about this just before we started, and I think it's a very powerful idea which these journalists really need to think about. Would you, if you had a hotline to a hostage who had a bomb strapped to them or a gun pointed at their head, would you ask them questions that are going to annoy or irritate the hostage taker? What are they going to say? They're going to say something that doesn't put themselves in danger. Even children have enough understanding to do that. Children who are 5 or 6 or older will have enough understanding of the situation to perhaps not put themselves in danger. It would be the same again of asking a Jew in Buchenwald in 1944, while the Gestapo is standing over them, well, how do you feel? How are you being treated here? It is no different.
interviewing the hostage while the hostage is kept, like, under supervision of its people who abducted her. I mean, we never share contact or personal information on children or adults who are still in Russia for interviews. Like, that's part of my initiative. We put together witnesses and victims of deportation with journalists, and we've been approached a couple of times by journalists. Could you share, like, a story of people who are still there? And our answer is always no. And the organizations we work with who actually evacuate people from Russia to Ukraine or other countries, so organizations who in direct contact with those people, all the contact information is super confidential, because you can't approach and endanger people who are still there and ask them about their experience. Their phones are listened to, their location is known to everyone. They are censored. They are hostages of the regime. You can't expect them to provide a genuine answer while they're in those circumstances. There are multiple victims who left Russia, and they're not only in Ukraine. Many of them actually are abroad, as they had to evacuate to Russia, Belarus, Estonia, and some of them ended up in Estonia or deeper in Europe. You can approach any of those people and receive the full picture and genuality, but reporters often looking for another side of a story, looking another angle, looking for another different opinion. And sometimes in the search of a different independent opinion, they're losing the truth.
And of course, those same journalists would understand that it's against the Geneva Convention for POWs to be interviewed on camera by the power that is holding them prisoner. And that's well understood. And in the early stage of the war, I saw a lot of journalists being absolutely outraged at the idea that prisoners of war would be filmed, even if that testimony seemed to be genuine, either by the Russian side or by the Ukrainian side. Journalists were outraged. To my mind, this is no different at all, because the children, the adults who have been deported are essentially prisoners of war. And even though I think the Geneva Convention doesn't actually sort of classify them as such, it certainly ought to, because they are hostages in this situation.
Yes, I before start working with the topic of deportation, I worked with the topic of prisoners of war. My family's friend, his son, was one of those prisoners of war. He was the defender of Mariupol. And we know multiple cases when prisoners of war have been recorded chest deep on camera and had electrical wires connected to their toes. So if they don't give the right answer, they're electrocuted. And military men who went through war training, prepared mentally, psychologically, to everything that may happen to them, would break down because of pain and torture and psychological pressure. How do we expect teenagers that have been brainwashed, that lived through occupation, horrors of war, deportation, that were immersed in a totally new and hostile environment that says that they just flips their world upside down? How do we expect them in that environment not break down and provide clear, unbiased picture of what was happening to them? I mean, the topic of deportation from legal and ethical standpoint is complicated to professionals like lawyers and communicators, advocates. How do you expect a child to understand what has been done wrong or right to the child? You can, but some reporters do, and we try to work with that. However, we would assume that 1 year into war, different standards would be applied and more things would be understood. We do hope that with time and with our efforts, we would be able to increase the standards of reporting. Some reporters totally understand it. We were approached and we provide a disclaimer. Look, we will provide you with contacts of witnesses, but only those who left Russia and can speak freely. And people would say like, yeah, obviously. But others would generally not understand why. So that's something we work with.
And something else, I think, which is little understood, but we understand that in our own neighborhoods, we understand that racism and discriminatory attitudes exist in, say, the UK and others. So if you apply that to your immediate surroundings, people would get it. But what I think they fail to understand is that often the Russian foster families and the Russian public in general have been brainwashed over, I was going to say the last couple of years, but obviously it's a lot longer than that. And they've been brainwashed through the Soviet Union and through the 19th century to have a certain attitude towards Ukrainians. And one of the real issues here as well is that those children might end up with foster families and they're going through the process of Russification. But if they were to display any sort of feeling for Ukraine, if they were to display, and even in their accent it must come out, if they were to show, any kind of Ukrainian features, they may well be, experiencing highly discriminatory attitudes.
Moreover, unfortunately, due to my work, I had to scan through like a lot of articles in Russian media to find out where they take children and what happens to them. And in one of the interviews, a journalist interviewed the foster, actual adopted mother who adopted a child from Ukraine. She didn't plan to adopt any children, but she was on those critical parent list. Like if there is a child that desperately needs to be adopted, we will call you up. And she got called up to adopt a child from probably the Donetsk region. I honestly don't remember. But what struck me is that they organize schools for parents, parenting schools, to teach parents to work with children that went through trauma or war, how to approach a child, what complications you could face. And that woman said that during those parenting schools, they were taught that you have to have a different approach to Ukrainian child because of their mentality. And the journalist inquired, what kind of different mentalities are they talking about? And the woman said, well, they implied that, Ukrainian kids could be more adaptive, sneaky in a way, or like more sly or something. They need to be need to watch out for those traits because one way or another, they haven't forgotten the Ukrainian roots. So they teach parents to approach the child already with prejudice, just because that child was taken away from Ukrainian land. And that's part of their forcible educational process, where they try to turn you from a free-willing citizen into the slave of the system.
And I think people, again, will not have seen any of these, but over the last couple of decades, soap operas and dramas are incredibly popular in Russia. And there's been a conscious effort, really, over the last decade or more, that when Ukrainians are cast as roles in dramas and so on, they'll often play sort of, the sneaky thief or the unintelligent sort of, servant or whatever, or they'll play generally kind of negative stereotyped characters. They won't play the lead. They won't be the super smart business person. I haven't watched many of these, I have to say, but many of the people I've spoken
Thank
to
God.
have tried to describe some of these dramas. I mean, horrific kind of stereotyping that bears no resemblance to actual Ukrainian character.
Well, it's part of the cultural propaganda. Everybody is bad except the main character, who is typical white Russian. Like, Ukrainians are peasants who are sly and trying to get their own way and never actually listen to the big ruling hand, try to find a way around, because that's what it was historically for Russia, who's trying to oppress Ukrainians. Ukrainians, being the minority, were trying to find a way around this big system. And they also portray negatively any kind of ethnical minorities that are in Russia. We always imagine Russian as this, blue-eyed white guy who is, brave and has this mysterious Russian soul. But the truth is that the majority of Russia has thousands of ethnical minorities that are oppressed and not considered Russian in Russia. So but that's not what portrayed in their movies, in their cultural products. You know, the same situation used to be in the US, where like American was always, you know, this strong white guy, even though there's like so many, you know, ethnical and racial minorities in here who didn't get any kind of portrayal, or only negative one, stereotypical in Hollywood. So it's not a new story. Again, we just need to understand that it's happening. Ukrainians, even like in the West, were usually being considered as, you know, there's also white Eastern Europeans. However, Ukraine also has a lot of, you know, ethnicities within it. Crimean Tatars are also by nationality Ukrainians. Maybe they're different ethnically, but they're still part of Ukraine. And like one of my colleagues is working on, you know, just like giving a stage, giving a voice to people in Ukraine who are different ethnicity. She herself is Nigerian Ukrainian, and she got fed up that the portrayal of Ukrainians is very stereotypical in media, and that's what we're working on. But yeah, like I'm not surprised that Russia had a lot of stereotypical images in their movies. My God, I saw those movies as a kid.
Well, you're
Trying to recover.
unfortunately, yes. You would have seen some of them, and people living in the East would have been bombarded with Russian dramas, where Ukrainian channels were certainly, since the occupation in 2014, would have been sort of blocked, and you'd have had as you say, a Ruski Mir information environment. Well, I've got two more sort of areas that I want to sort of go through in the time we've got left. One, of course, is to go through what the organization you're involved in, where are our people, you know, how it got started, how it runs, how you try and sort of generate publicity for that. But before we get to that, I'd like to sort of also dispel another myth, and that is that somehow these deportation schemes and the adoption schemes are a result of the invasion. Actually, your organization and others have actually uncovered evidence, haven't you, that there was a lot of planning before the full-scale war began to put in place the infrastructure for this deportation process, and especially with children in mind, which I think people listening to this will find it horrific to understand that it wasn't a reaction to the warlike situation, but it was actually a premeditated process. And it was always intended that tens of thousands of children would be essentially sort of kidnapped. And the other horrific irony is that a lot of this is actually organized in conjunction with Russia's Society for Civil and Human Rights, which is obviously the ultimate insult. But could you talk a little bit about the preparation that Russia seems to have done for this massive kidnapping?
Yes, as I've mentioned before, Russians are experienced in this kind of tool. And I think it was Timothy Snyder who, one of his lectures, would talk about Germans using deportation and for the same reasons. And I think one of the Germans' higher-ranking officials in his report to Hitler would describe that Soviets are so much better in organizing deportations. They just have like a mechanism and a system in place, and they could just like very efficiently deport huge masses of people because they have a developed scenario, and we should learn from them. So I give my full compliments to Russia on executing that quite successfully. We know that that was planned in advance, because you just can't put up such a big infrastructure and people in place to process all the deported people just out of the blue. We also received like leaked documents that indicate that, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church was involved in the process before the invasion. They received the schedules of buses that will bring deported Ukrainians to the processing facilities, and then will distribute them to facilities, including Russian Orthodox facilities for hosting, as they call them, refugees. But in like Russian Orthodox Church executes this in coordination with the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russia. So it's a lot of different, very well organized and put together for communication organizations that could not just find its way to each other and put the system in place out of the blue during the active offense of Russia into Ukraine. It's definitely planned. It's policy of Russia that is not only supported by the infrastructure, but also by legislation. And as Putin recently, accepted that order that allows accelerated grantship of Russian citizenship to children who were deported from Ukraine. So if you look into the process of adoption in Russia, it's not easy, very bureaucratic, but when they adopt Ukrainian children, it's much more easier and you get more benefits for adopting the child of war. And it's one of the encouraging motivational mechanisms for people to adopt Ukrainian kids if they want to get someone fast. So all that indicates that Russia knows what it's doing. It has facilities like in occupied areas of Donbass, and then facilities to process and put children to facilities in place for adoption in Russia.
And they would have known, of course, they would have had a plan for how to use this story, as you say, to help sell their mission to the internal population.
Yeah.
That's been incredibly effective within Russian propaganda. And recently we saw probably one of the most stomach-churning incidents, wasn't it? And it was a girl, the most visible one was a girl from Mariupol, surrounded by some other children who were younger. She was a teenager. And at some point, she was put on show in the middle of a stadium. This was at the army event in Moscow. And of course, people are busting from the provinces. We know it's very staged managed. There's no normal local Muscovites there in the audience. But she was forced to physically hug the commander of the forces that were involved in leveling Mariupol to the ground. So essentially forced in public to show gratitude to her tormentor, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, I work with this for many months, and every day I'm like, you can't get lower than that. I mean, that's the bottom at the bottom. Yeah, Russian was able to break that bottom many times. And the event in Luzhniki that you referred to, when they put a teenage girl and a bunch of like smaller kids to say thank you for liberation and rescue, and the girl lost her ability to speak, so they forced her to hug Uncle Yura, who destroyed their city. That was pretty cynical. We actually identified the girl, and we know that her mother was killed in the shelling of Mariupol by Russian forces. So that's just to give an understanding of how happy the child probably was.
I mean, for those who think it was a genuine emotion, this is a person who's been liberated from her family by having them killed, liberated from her home, which is destroyed, and liberated from her lifestyle and her prospects in her homeland, and her entire city has been razed to the ground. So anyone who looks at that superficially and sees her smiling there, they have to understand the backdrop of extreme terror and suffering, and then subsequent brainwashing at the hands of Russians that happened behind the scenes where we can't see it.
Yeah, this girl is real, and there was her sister present on stage with her then. But we have to understand, even if this girl was not real, Russia would make it up. Like, there is nothing preventing them from making up a random child who actually learns lines by heart and gives a very heartfelt speech about liberation. So but yeah, these kids, I'm sure they were real, from Mariupol, and I would prefer to move on from the topic. It's really
it's just too traumatic. Well, the last question is, what are the organizations that you're involved in? The PR Army of Ukraine, RAZOM, and Where Are Our People? What are you able to do about this, and how are you able to raise awareness of this? Because for me, it's been shocking how little coverage this topic has got over the last 6 months. I interviewed a very talented journalist 6 months ago on this topic, and the video's up there for people to see. And I thought, I thought this topic would get so much more attention, but it has been misunderstood and ignored, I think, in the Western media. So what are you able to do? And what are your colleagues doing to raise awareness?
So the problem you're referring to, the lack of coverage, is the whole reason why we started Where Are People? At least like in summer and autumn, like there was coverage, there were like news about it, but it in no way reflected the full scale of the tragedy that was happening. So we realized it happens because people don't understand this problem. Deportation is something that means something absolutely different in other countries. Like deportation in any country is a legal process of taking someone like an alien, right, a foreign citizen, to his homeland, not taking someone from their homeland into the foreign state. So we understood that there is a lack of understanding, there is lack of testimonies, because it's hard to find witnesses. They are often unwilling to speak. It's pretty traumatic experience. Nobody seeks glories or publicity from it. So we started to increase awareness about this problem in the media, to provide full picture of what's happening, because once we provided witnesses and like what's happening right now, we face with the questions, well, why is it happening? And that's when we start working on providing historical context, investigations in why it was happening in the past, why it is happening right now. So now, right now, we work in the direction of media relations, where we put together like witnesses with the journalists in order to share their stories with the world and keep those stories, circulating on people's minds. We also work with like research and archiving, like investigation of these crimes, and like putting together articles of the historical context. And we're working like advocating and promoting this topic with the decision makers in international organizations, other NGOs, or political decision makers, so that people who can change something do something. So they had all the information about the topic and understand its seriousness, and that would encourage them to pay attention to it and eventually take action. Unfortunately, just like in the matter with prisoners of war, this is not something that Ukraine can solve on its own. We can't just, go to Russia and take our children back. And we require some kind of mediation in the matter and interference of third parties, independent parties, who can, stop deportations and repatriate children back. So we have to bring this topic close enough to many stakeholders, like international organizations like UN agencies, or like international rescue agencies, and the governments of states who have a say or resources to put some process in place. So that's what we've been working with the most.
And that's very important to know. And I think we've got, what I'll do, I'll put links in the description of this video. And I really encourage people to check out the profiles. There's your profile, there's the profile of RAZOM, and there's another great interview you've got there. On that with Peter Pomerantsev, who's also appeared on this channel. I think people who are aware of him highly value his opinions. We've got a link to the Ukrainian PR army and the campaigns they run, and we're also going to put a link in there, of course, to Where Are My People. So I really encourage people to follow and subscribe to these links so they can see the latest information, the latest research. And I really hope a lot of people engage with this video and share it around, because I think this is one of the most important topics, and it's one where victory will not just happen on the battlefield. Victory will only happen when all these children are returned to the family. And if the family aren't present, then at least return to their country and their culture, because this is a horrific crime.
Yes, I agree. And you make a very good point that like one of our like final goals is make the world understand that the war doesn't happen only with like liberation of Ukraine. Liberation of Ukraine is a crucial way to stop deportations, because deportations happen only in occupied areas by Russia. So there are people who, you know, feel very bad for abducted children, and they're ready to do something about that, but then they don't want to provide weapons for Ukraine because you don't need them. And we're trying to connect the dots and make people understand that Ukraine can stop deportation of children if it can liberate its territories and defend its territories. This is not two different questions. It's all one question of Ukrainian victory. And another part of the question is that we don't only fight for our territories, we fight for our people. And Russia knows it. And Russia knows that even if it loses all the territories, it will still have the leverage and could claim partial victory by, you know, retaining Ukrainians inside. And we need to get our people back. And we can't just, you know, like kick Russia out and build a wall and forget about it forever. We need to make sure this will not repeat in, you know, 10, 20, 100 years, and that all the people affected would have a possibility to return to Ukraine. There is a lot of damage, irreversible damage that has been done, but there is still damage that could be, you know, like fixed in a way. And that's what we're trying to do. I do encourage to check out our partners. So a lot of organizations work on different aspects of this, you know, the legal, the advocacy, the communications, you know, the physical repatriation of Ukrainians. And unfortunately, no big international organization, you know, supports these efforts. Most of them are volunteer-based. And it's really hard to return 2 million Ukrainians, you know, on the shoulders of a couple of volunteer organizations that carry that burden. So if, you know, anyone is willing to support Ukrainian efforts into returning their citizen, I encourage you to support those organizations that actually do the work, because we're still looking forward to the support from, you know, international organizations that is not provided yet. Let's just say.
We hope that there'll be some progress on that. And of course, we know that Russia wants to keep these people, because any future negotiation around lifting sanctions, they must know that they will eventually lose the war. There must be some kind of idea in their heads now that it's at least a possibility. And so this topic needs to have more awareness ahead of any kind of potential, you know, negotiation, you know, once Ukraine is victorious. Well, Kateryna, I wish you the best of luck in this process and in the campaigns you're running. It's an extraordinary cause, and I only wish it would get more coverage. But I'm very, very grateful that you've spent so long explaining it to us and in such clarity and detail. Good luck with that, and of course, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you, Jonathan.